Hello and welcome to this updating event. My name is Richard Stowe and I'm the Managing Director here at Weed Free Limited, and we're delighted to be the lead sponsor of this year's updating events. Weed Free has been an active member and supporter of the Amenity Forum for 12 years. We are a BASIS Amenity Assured contractor specialising in railway weed control. Our core staff all hold both railway and pesticide competencies, allowing us to apply herbicides to the rail network here in the UK, both by hand and from rail-borne machines. If you'd like to know a little bit more about the work that we do here at Weed Free, please feel free to give me a call. These updating events are an ideal opportunity for the Amenity Forum to reach out to potential new members, raise awareness and share industry updates and regulatory changes. I hope you enjoy today and find this event both useful and informative. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to John to introduce the first speaker. Thank you very much.
Well, as I say, it's great to have this. This is the last of our updating events, and we should all be in Scotland, or the speakers should be in Scotland. And I always enjoy going to Scotland, but there you are. We've got to do it virtual. I think the updating events have worked quite well on the interactive, but I think it will be nice to get back to the real thing next year, hopefully. Now, it's really a great pleasure for me because as over the recent times, we've established really strong links with Scottish Government. And as you may know, just over a year ago, the then Minister for Rural Affairs actually launched the Amenity Standard for us in Scotland. So today, we have got a short presentation from Ben Macpherson. Ben was elected as a member of the Scottish Parliament for the Edinburgh North and Leith constituency in 2016, and I believe he lives in that beautiful part of the world. Since June 2018, he's served as a Scottish minister, and he became Minister for Rural Affairs and the Natural Environment in December 2020. I understand Ben is a committed internationalist. He's passionate about social justice and sustainable as well as inclusive economic progress. So Kate will now just play the short video presentation from Ben.
A warm welcome to you all. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ben Macpherson, and in December last year, I was delighted to take up a new role in the Scottish Government as Minister for Rural Affairs and the Natural Environment, with responsibility for this important and dynamic portfolio. This is a critical time in our collective fight against climate change, as together we take new steps to protect Scotland's wonderful and diverse natural environment. And as well, it is a crucial time for Scotland's communities and businesses because of the pandemic and as we adapt to life outside of the European Union. And it's also an important time for pesticide regulation and continuing to address the question of how we sustainably manage the threats that pests pose. And over recent years, we have rightly seen a much greater public and political interest in pesticide use, and this is set to become even more prevalent in the public consciousness as we become responsible for the regulatory functions and scrutiny which were previously carried out at EU level or shared with other member states. Therefore, more than ever, it's essential that we get better at communicating what we are doing and, crucially, why we are doing it. That we improve our engagement with pesticide users and organisations like the Amenity Forum, listening to your views and experience to better understand the needs of and options available for those growing our food, trees and managing our amenity spaces. And as such, it's a pleasure to open the Amenity Forum's Scottish Updating event this year. You will all know more than most that what happens in the management of our amenity spaces affects us all every day. Circumstances over this last year, with the increase of exercising outdoors, has really brought home the importance of our appreciation of safe and healthy public spaces. We need to maintain and develop our amenity spaces, but we need to do this in a way which is safe and which provides the general public and users of amenity spaces with clear assurances that all those involved are operating at the highest professional standards. The Amenity Standard, launched by my predecessor Marie Goujon MSP at the Scottish Amenity event last year, is designed to provide that reassurance, and I would like to take the opportunity to reiterate its benefits and to encourage you to ensure that your weed, pest and disease management operations meet the Amenity Standard, whether those are undertaken in-house or by an external contractor. And those operating to the standard are committing to an integrated approach to amenity management and to the highest professional standards. The Amenity Standard, your engagement with it, and the work of the Amenity Forum generally is really important, and I want to emphasise that today. The Scottish Government continues to support the work of the Amenity Forum through its work, promoting best practice and reporting directly to us as government on such matters. By doing all of that, we seek to ensure sustainable approaches to the vital task of amenity management. In conclusion, I wish you well for today's event, and as Minister for Rural Affairs and the Natural Environment, I am committed to working with land managers to promote an integrated approach to weed, pest and disease management, and to raise awareness on pesticide use, and to continue to drive up standards across all sectors.
Good. Well, and we are very grateful indeed for the Minister taking time to speak to us. And I'd like to thank as well Alan in the office and Romy and others who are supporting very, very strongly the work of the forum, and we are grateful for that. Right, now what I'm going to do is just do a brief introduction before you get on to a presentation from Adrian. Hopefully that's on the screen now. Right, so again, thank you and welcome to you all to today's event. This is the last of the events. We normally, to be honest, we normally get something like about 400 odd to all the update events, but we run about 13. This time we'll have probably reached about 200 odd people, which is obviously less, but of course it's to do with the format and it's to do with the numbers of people that we have had. So again, thank you to Weed Free, who have made last year's and this year's events possible in terms of resourcing, but also particularly today, Rigby Taylor, who are the event supporter, and we'll be hearing from them later on. But again, thank you very much to them, particularly as well to Peter Corbett, who's always been a strong supporter of the forum. And as I say, thank you to the Scottish Government for the way we're working with them. So there you are. There's where we've been. Well, I've been in my home office all the time, but apparently that's where I've been. Ended up in Scotland. Again, I know on the line there's a lot of people who know all this already, but it's always helpful just in case there are people not. As I always say, when I took over the role as independent chairman of the Amenity Forum, it was a much smaller organisation then, but basically I needed to get my head round what amenity was and what it did. And I came across the sort of Swiss Army penknife approach, and I've used this with government officials, MPs, all sorts, and everybody always loves it. So I keep on putting it on. It'll go on until I sort of leave the forum's activities. And in terms of the forum, it's always important as well to recognise we're a voluntary initiative. And as such, we sit in a way between the policymakers and the sector. What we try to do is to bring the sector together as one, to respond to government agendas, and equally to be a way of communicating backwards and forwards in relation to that. I'm the independent chairman because I don't have any interest in amenity, commercial interest in amenity business. And I think that's equally important. And of course, I came about 10 or 11 years ago. We were much smaller than, as I say, we've now grown considerably. And I think we embrace all aspects of amenity. We have over 100 members now, including quite a number of local authorities, but also manufacturers, distributors, contractors, a whole range of people. And so I think we genuinely can speak on behalf of the sector. And I think Adrian will pick up in a minute, but when the current UK action plan was being formulated, I think there was a view that amenity was, if you like, a bit behind things. I suggest to you now that we're probably in front of things in terms of what we do. There's still work to be done, but there's been an enormous amount done by working together. That's far too busy a slide, but again, we shall make all these presentations. In fact, I can say this is the last one. Shortly after this one, we'll make all the presentations available, and we're also recording the presentations, and we've got a company going to edit them, so we can actually send edited versions of each of these presentations out to you. So you'll see that there, but it's always it's my touchstone as to what we actually are all about. But if you want to know more, go onto our website, www.amenityforum. And then the other two sites, the one is on the Amenity Standard, which you'll hear more about, but is fundamental to what we're doing going forward. And then thirdly, sorry, somebody's come on my screen and I don't know why. Hang on a minute. And thirdly, the Get Britain Moving site, which is our public-facing site. And again, I'll say a little bit more about that later on. I just wanted to mention this survey. Now, there has been a survey done in Scotland as well, which we've been very involved with helping get involved doing with. But this is a major UK survey. This has been undertaken by FRA on behalf of CRD. And basically, it's very, very important that people respond to this survey. There was a survey done in 2016 of amenity pesticide usage. And I have to say the response was not good. Now, that was primarily, I suggest, because the questions and the survey were very agriculturally based and we had to adapt it for amenity. Now, that didn't work. And as a consequence, this year, we've been working very closely with CRD and FRA to ensure the survey is much more user-friendly and is amenity-based. And so if you have been contacted to complete a survey form, please do so. I understand from my last report last week, the response rate is very good this year, which is good news. But we particularly want to hear from local authorities, from the rail and highways network, and from golf in particular. But as I say, it's for everybody. DEFRA are very keen to get a good response to this because people like me keep on telling them how important pesticides are and what the practice is, but we need good, solid evidence. So please, as I say, if you've had a request, do return it because it's very, very important for the sector as a whole. Now, I had to rejig slightly the programme because obviously we did have that very important contribution by the Minister. But so, as you can see, we're still on time. In fact, we're slightly ahead of time, so Adrian doesn't need to rush through. But basically, we will start off with a policy update from Adrian. We'll then move on to my sort of usual slot, but basically this time I want to focus very much on the new National Action Plan, which is being currently put together. There's been a consultation, and that's really an important plan because it will be a UK plan, but of course each national government will be responsible for implementing it. So again, it's quite important that you hear some of the factors there. We'll then have a sort of facilitated session. What you do is Kate presses a magic button and you go into breakout groups and you will discuss things, come back. Then there'll be time for questions. to Adrian, myself, or what has come out of those groups. We'll then have a presentation by Rigby Taylor, a short update on the standard, and then we can conclude. And finally, in terms of my introduction, none of the things I ever do are complete without some kind of quote. We have come through a tremendously hard time. I mean, nobody can actually overstate what has happened. Our whole lives have been turned upside down. There's been personal tragedies. There's all sorts of things have happened. And so I sort of made a point of using this one this time. Someday, everything will make perfect sense. So for now, laugh at the confusion, smile through the tears, and keep reminding yourself that everything happens for a reason. In my case, it's made me very much focus on what's really important in life and what is less important to me. And so I think there's quite a lot of lessons coming out of this, which I hope we can build on. But what hasn't it been good that the amenity sector has come through and really delivered, really demonstrated the essential nature of the work it does, keeping our highways going, keeping our rails going, keeping our parks clean. It has been a tremendous achievement by the sector, and I want to pay tribute to all involved. Right. Now, we've got the convict here. He says this is his passport photo or whatever, but he sent it.
Now, it used to be.
He sent it to me. But can I just say, Adrian's been involved with all of these updated events, and he is a very busy man, and I am really grateful for Adrian for doing this. And who better to talk to us about sort of the policy update and regulations. Over to you, Adrian.
Thanks, John. You can move off the photo rather quickly, I think. And just by way of introduction, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Adrian Dixon. I head one of the two operational policy teams in HSE's Chemicals Regulation Division. We're obviously the bit of government that regulates pesticides on behalf of all four administrations. Pesticide policy is devolved to England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. But HSE, through a series of agency agreements, then delivers the regulatory work for all those bodies. So we're sort of sitting at the centre of things. And by way of personal background, I've been doing this role or similar since 2005. So I've seen the development of the Amenity Forum very much at close hand and worked very closely with John and colleagues for a number of years. And it's been tremendous to see how things have developed. And I was also involved in the negotiations for the Sustainable Use Directive, as were colleagues. So that's my background. Next slide, please, John. What I want to talk to you about in the few minutes this morning is give you an overview of the legal framework and particularly how things have changed following EU exit. Give you some headings and reminders around the whole issues around sustainable use. And the current National Action Plan, as John mentioned, which was published in 2013, and then a bit around the National Action Plan consultation. Next slide, please, John. Yeah, we've got this one off to a T now. John can do the transitions on my slide better than I can. Here's a slide which some of you may have seen before. We find it very useful to explain the PPP, plant protection product life cycle, in this way, because it actually illustrates where the different bits of the legislation bite quite nicely. So we've got the pre-marketing controls in the authorization legislation 1107/2009, which has been retained into national law. We have the controls on use in the Sustainable Use Directive, which was implemented in the in national legislation in the Sustainable Use Regulations, so that's still there. And then around disposal and degradation of pesticides, we have a raft of things ranging from the controls on maximum residue levels and the monitoring that we do around that, through to things like the Water Framework Directive levels and waste legislation. So there's a number of different bits of legislation that bite on the end of the pesticide life cycle. And then across all that, we have the whole measurement of things, how things are progressing. John's just mentioned the Amenity survey, which is an important part of the cycle of the pesticide usage surveys, which Scotland does its surveys and feeds into as well to give us that comprehensive picture. And as I say, we're grateful for all the input that we get across the UK from colleagues on all these areas. And also the other thing that sits across all of this, and does it depends on which bit of the legislation it is, are actually the controls and enforcement aspect, which again is changing because of the official controls regulation, which came in 2019. So there's a developing program of work there. Next slide, please, John. As I mentioned, obviously the legislation has changed. We're no longer in the EU. What we've done is retain the EU legislation, but fixed it to make it operable so that it actually works. Obviously, the number of references in the EU legislation to EU institutions and EU mechanisms, which don't work now that we're outside the EU. So that's what we mean by fixing the legislation. But effectively, we've still kept it in the same, in sort of similar blocks. So this slide and the next slide list the various bits of legislation which have introduced changes to the retained legislation. So there's one around the corrections for 1107, the authorisations regulation. There's another one around the sustainable use corrections that are needed and things that go on there, and similarly with the maximum residue levels legislation 396 of 2005. Again, next slide, please, John. And then, of course, there have had to be further statutory instruments as the EU system has carried on changing as we were working through the transition period and things. So there's a number of pieces of legislation there which have corrected things, obviously, because there's whole rafts of legislation, so there's bound to be little bits slip in and need correcting. There was also late in the day the Northern Ireland Protocol, which again needed changes to legislation to separate out the GB implications from the Northern Ireland system. And then, as it says at the bottom, there will be a further statutory instrument, actually should say this year, unfortunately, because the slide was written and I missed the change, sometime later this year, just to pick up any EU decisions that have happened up to the end of the transition period. So, you know, from our last bit of national legislation through to the end of December. So that's another piece of work that's still going on. Next slide, please, John. Just to run through a bit of the detail around active substances and products. We have an active substance, a statutory active substance register now, which you can find on our website, and that basically is the list of GB approved active substances. We're working on a GB review program. We're just at the stage of sort of internal thinking within government, and then that will go wider once we've actually sort of internally within government. But the main proviso is that we can actually review active substance approvals at any time if something pops up that shows there's a concern that needs to be looked at. So things don't totally stand still. But the overriding point is that active substance approvals, which were due to expire before December 2023, have been extended for 3 years so that we can develop a GB review program. But obviously we want to try and get on with that as soon as we can. It's not in anybody's interest just to keep sort of things rolling on. So that's where we are on actives. Next slide, please, John. A bit about the thinking around the active substance review program. We obviously need a program that works effectively and is manageable and proportionate and doesn't sort of take up a lot of resource. There are various ways of doing it. Obviously, you know, we could think about whether we make use of assessments by other regulators or do more of our own assessments. We could look at the approach for the review, so group actives by classes of chemicals or across bits of legislation or by function. Obviously, the EU programme has worked chronologically, just taking chemicals as they came up by date order, and that has meant that in some cases, chemicals have been knocked off, leaving ones that could be seen as more risky still out there. So it's not an ideal way of doing things. But the main message is we're obviously working on that, and you'll see more about that. Next slide, please, John. Product applications, again, we've rolled things over so that authorisations that were issued before we left the EU carry on being valid in GB and Northern Ireland. Now that we've left the EU, authorisations will specify where they are valid, and the key point is that applicants will require authorisation under both the GB and Northern Ireland regime to get access to both markets. We're not changing any data requirements or the format for new applications, so that should make things better, easy, well, keep things the same for people. And we have been processing things before the end of the transition period as usual. Next slide, please, John. We've had a number of questions around the reference numbers, the map numbers on products, and where possible, we're trying to keep these simple and keep them the same unless there are significant changes. And that's an issue that we've been in contact with distributors and particularly AIC and others about. We want to keep labelling as common as we can do, but obviously there may be divergence due to changes in expiry dates in active substances, or if we take a different decision to the EU, or if we make a decision at a different time to the EU. So that's going to happen, and it will impact on conditions of authorization and data protection periods, etc. Next slide, please, John. So in summary, now we are in a new independent pesticide regulatory regime in Great Britain, so England, Scotland and Wales. We take responsibility for our own decisions on pesticides using our own rules. But all existing active substance approvals, authorisations and MRLs carry on being valid. Existing products carry on being valid, and we've got the extension of active substance approvals. And we will ultimately set GB maximum residue levels based on our own assessments, but we've carried over the existing ones until they're amended. And the key thing is that obviously for the Northern Ireland regime, they continue to follow the EU rules under the Northern Ireland Protocol. So we in CRD are effectively operating two systems. Next slide, please, John. Just to move on to sustainable use context, as I said, all the pesticide policy has devolved, so we need to look to each government's different strategies. Obviously, Scotland has its own environment strategy, so that sets a context for sustainable use of pesticides in Scotland. And then there are other overreaching ones as well around biodiversity, carbon net zero targets, and the wider international context and agreements that GB and UK work to. Next slide, please, John. But what the legislation is trying to do as a whole, and what all the governments are trying to do, is basically get sustainable use of pesticides by reducing risk and impact on health and the environment, promoting the use of IPM and alternative approaches, and trying to get that balance, basically, as I think the Minister set out very nicely in his presentation at the start of this conference. And the sustainable use legislation sort of effectively sets out key areas for national actions. Next slide, please, John. Just a reminder of the basic requirements around sustainable use. It is an updating event, so just to remind you, there is the need for specified certificates to be held by users, and CPD at the minute is a recommendation. That's how the legislation was translated at the time when it came in. Sales of products, the buyers have to make sure the end user holds a certificate, the appropriate certificate, and there is a requirement for distributors to have certification as well. Application equipment, a nice little phrase, if you can ride on it, you must get it tested. And obviously regular calibration goes with the whole point about professionalism and good practice. Next slide, please, John. There are some trickier aspects of sustainable use which require a bit more interpretation. And the whole question of taking reasonable precautions and making sure that things hit the target, etc., and demonstrating due diligence, a slightly woollier. Protecting water, that's obviously a very high profile issue in all parts of the UK. There are standards that apply that are there for good reasons, and so there's a need for the awareness of risk to water. IPM is obviously another priority across all the regions, all the governments, and those 4 key principles of actually suppressing problems and then monitoring and choosing the right intervention is key. Next slide, please, John. That's a picture of the current UK National Action Plan, which was published in 2013, just so that you can remind yourselves what it looks like. Next slide, please, John. And as John said at the outset, one of the priority areas was improving practice in the amateur and amenity sector. And I think the Amenity Forum in particular has done a great job there, pushing out an awful lot of guidance, developing a lot of guidance and developing the standards. Enhanced protection of water is another one that was in the previous National Action Plan, or rather current till it's replaced. And then the whole question around integrated approaches, pesticides as part of a toolbox of control measures, and making sure that R&D on integrated approaches was actually passed out to those who need it. The whole question of knowledge transfer. Next slide, please, John. That slide is now, of course, slightly out of date in that the NAP consultation, the National Action Plan consultation, concluded last Friday. But basically it just sets out the high level aim of the National Action Plan consultation and the key goals. I think it's important to stress that it's a UK wide plan that's been developed by all 4 administrations together, and it's just DEFRA who have been coordinating the consultation. So it can be a UK consultation, and it has been developed to apply to all pesticide users. The bottom bullet was one that I've been using to remind people about the deadline, but now we've passed that, so we can move on. Next slide, please, John. And that's it. So a bit of a whistle-stop tour through things, but we'll no doubt pick up some of the issues in questions later on. But as ever, it's been very good to address you all, and thanks for your time for listening. Thanks, John.
Thank you again, Adrian. That's really helpful. I think it's really good because what you've done is reminded us what the existing plan is, what the new plan's going to be, but also the areas around regulation. And there's an awful lot of work being done and still being done. And I'm grateful for the forum being involved with consultations on all of that, because clearly it's very important to the sector, but there's quite a bit of work to do. And then we have the slight complication of Northern Ireland, but we won't get into that as I speak now. But thank you, Adrian. That's really good. We're not going to take questions of Adrian now. What I'm going to do is press on, and then, as I say, we'll do the breakout groups, and then we can have a sort of wider questions after that. So what I thought I would do this time is I would look at the new plan. Now, basically, as we all know, we left the EU, and so there is all these changes happening, and the UK governments decided we needed a new national action plan, and as Adrian said, that's been out for consultation. The consultation has now closed. We made a response on behalf of the sector, and I circulated all members, and we talked to members, and I hope I know a number of organisations also responded to it. Now, basically, within about 12 weeks, we will get some form of report back on that, with the idea, hopefully, that the new plan will be implemented before the end of this year. But as I say, all these timetables are not in my control, but that's where we are going. And as Adrian said, it has to relate to all the various strategies within the devolved administrations, and in Scotland there's the environmental strategy for Scotland. So again, I just want to emphasise what Adrian said. It was a consultation on behalf of all 4 national administrations, DEFRA acting as the main point of contact in terms of managing the process. So, as a forum, we're in contact with DEFRA, we're in contact with governments and everybody else, trying to ensure that the amenity voice is part of it. Now, I think, and it's quite useful to sort of try and identify what the key drivers are, and 5 here are important. First of all, reducing our reliance on plant protection products. That doesn't mean not using them, but it says reducing our reliance. How can we target? How can we innovate so we can reduce the reliance on them? Protect people's health, the environmental protection, and within that, the net carbon, the carbon zero targets. And I think that's becoming crucially important now in relation to a lot of things that we are looking at and the ways we approach amenity management, best practice and training, and then monitoring use and impact. And this is a whole discussion going on. And by the way, these are all in the way that the consultation was done. Was there were different task groups within DEFRA, all headed up by different people. And so it's been quite interesting time. I've got used to a lot of Zoom conversations and Teams conversations in terms of doing this. And I just want to mention water, of course, because Adrian mentioned that as well. That's becoming quite a crucial area for us to get involved with. And then the key driver priorities, I suspect driving most governments, but driving most of the things we do: public money for public goods, environmental protection, sustainability, carbon, health and safety, and of course an overriding one in terms of the country as a whole in relation to recovering from where we have been in the last 12 months or so, driving up productivity and if you like, getting the economic recovery that is required. So what I'm going to do now is just go through the consultation document and our response alongside the 5 sort of, if you like, key areas that were identified in the document that was produced. I'm going to pay credit to DEFRA for this particular consultation document. I remember the last one that Adrian referred to, leading up to the current plan. I always used to say it was one of the best things I had. If I couldn't sleep on a night, started to read it, because it was a very, very thick document. Whereas this, I think, is much more succinct and actually really quite useful to read through. So first of all, it was about ensuring continued robust regulation to protect our health and environment. And what I've done, because as I say, these are 2 busy slides, so you'll get copies of the presentation afterwards. But the ones in red are what I wanted to sort of pull out as key things I saw. Develop a system which is simpler for users, promote positive innovation, review the regulation for biopesticides, and I'd bring into that category biostimulants, but we'll come to that, and IPM approaches. So, Adrian mentioned these, but these run through the document writ large in terms of their sort of ensuring continued robust regulation. And again, I'm not going to repeat all this because this is something that Adrian said. A number of members have asked me where you find this. So I did produce a sort of member briefing. And if you want a copy of that, contact Kate, because it will direct you to the right part on the website for it. But I know there's a lot of people have come back to me about glyphosate. And, just let's be clear what Adrian said. Following departure from the EU, approval for glyphosate had a current expiry date of 2012 and has been extended until 15th of December 2015 in Great Britain. Unless, of course, something absolutely comes out of the blue, which we don't understand. Obviously, again, because of the Northern Ireland Protocol, that means that it's the approval process which is already ongoing. Reapproval in EU will apply to Northern Ireland, but in Great Britain, it has been extended till 2025. So what's our response to the document? Now, again, far too busy a slide here, but let's just sort of pick out some things here. First of all, we've emphasised we do agree it needs to be a rigorous and robust regulatory system. I don't think anybody would argue against that. We think it should be a process based upon understanding the science and analysing all the evidence. And as I think we all know, that in recent times, there's perhaps been in the EU system, it's become slightly more political and extended. And so we're hoping that now, under our control, we can move that forward in a slightly different way. And in implementing the regulatory system, when deciding to withdraw an active or a product, the process needs to consider fully unintended consequences. Now, that doesn't mean you don't withdraw them, but we do feel there needs to be a discussion around how that process of withdrawing products is managed. Or else what tends to happen is that people will reach for products which they shouldn't reach for. There's a whole, at the end of the day, if you've got to maintain golf greens for a golf course and you lose a product, you've still got to maintain golf greens. And so I think, all we're actually saying is it's really quite important when that withdrawal is done that we actually do look at all those we call unintended consequences. Obviously, we would like to see the ever-escalating cost of approvals addressed, because clearly that is a concern, certainly in Amenity. Although we obviously believe Amenity to be very important, when you look at pesticide usage, we're probably 10% of the use compared to agriculture. And so therefore, if the costs are high, it means that the companies may well not bring forward products for Amenity that we want. And the final bit on the bottom there is also important. Sorry, I keep getting a picture on my screen. I don't know why. And the final one is the bottom, that we must review all life cycle consequences. Now, I think this is increasingly important, and I don't want to steal the fire of, I think Peter Corbett may well talk about this, but when you are looking at methods of managing amenity spaces, we do need to look at all those life cycle consequences, the carbon footprint implications, sustainability, as well as health. So, again, we're suggesting that we'd like to engage in that kind of discussion around that. In the terms of biopesticides, of course, we welcome them. We think there's enormous potential in there, but we do think there's a need to look at the review of how they are approved, if you like. And I think, probably more in the sort of area of biostimulants, but the current regulatory system can create a somewhat grey area. Now, I know many people will be familiar with that, but you've got products which have a primary purpose, which are biological, if you like, but it have a secondary function of controlling pests or whatever. Under the current system, those products don't fall under plant protection product requirements because they're regarded as products which are being used for its core purpose. Now, again, I'm not against them, but it is creating some real concern that we actually have that process, if you like, very clear in concise in going forward. And so that's a discussion that we've engaged with Adrian and his team in a very positive way to look at this sort of way forward that might happen. Because of time, I can't go through in real detail. So there are other things we've responded on. We do support further scientific research. There's some amazing innovation and research work going on at places like STRI and Syngenta's Gellets Hill and all sorts of other places. But we do think that's important. But we equally think it's important that people think about amenity. I think I've already said to you, the last 12 months have emphasised why amenity is so important. Wasn't it good to hear the minister say impacts on every citizen every day? Because he is spot on. What we do does, and it's really important that we give emphasis when we look at research there. We think about stewardship. I've raised the issues that, and in certain instances, I think the particular circumstances and aspects of amenity are not taken fully into account. So in other words, when we're looking at approvals, it should be looking at it in an amenity context, not an agricultural context with amenity added on. And that to me is not the way that we should look at it. And also this idea of additional registration requirements. There is a view that often they're over and above what's required in agriculture, which can be very expensive and can hold back new chemistry, which could be of use to us as a sector. The second thing in the document was support the development and uptake of integrated pest management, IPM. And the document does go through that. It says it wants to work with stakeholders to ensure all pesticide users will adopt these approaches. I'm very grateful to quite a number of our member organisations who took part in a recent workshop because DEFRA appointed ADAS consultants to look at integrated and in the amenity context, which I'm really pleased they put 2 workshops up around that to get some feedback from us, because it's quite important. And I think the message has been getting through that actually in amenity, we're often slightly ahead of the game when it comes to integrated approaches compared to agriculture. Many of you have been involved with integrated approaches for a long time. Now, I'm going to raise this because I don't like this. In the actual document, there is this triangle, and I don't like it for 2 main reasons. One is, if you look at that triangle, it tends to indicate that chemical is the last resort, and in fact, it looks as if it could be quite dangerous. And I don't like the word chemical, because chemical sounds as if this is a horrible thing, chemicals. Well, actually, all of us, and I'm speaking now, my body's made up of chemicals. Things that I use, my laptop is part of chemicals. So I don't like that, and I've made that point in the document. I much prefer the circle diagram, because what actually integrated approaches to me is, and sustainable management is, it's about saying in every particular situation, we look at all the possible solutions and we pull together the right mix for particular cases that we're involved with. So, I think it really is quite important we say that. I think the other thing in the document, well, there's 2 other things. One is it often refers to alternatives to plant protection products, and I don't like alternatives because I think it's about saying other methods. It's about looking at the whole pot. It isn't about either using plant protection products or not. It's about getting the right mix, which will minimize the use, but will actually reduce our reliance, but put it in an integrated way. And I think the other part of their document is that they talk a lot about environment, but mention less economic. And of course, at the end of the day, we have to produce systems that are economic in terms of amenity management. And we have, as you know, we already have documents. We used an external consultant in 2019 to produce a very comprehensive guidance on integrated weed management. And then there was another, which was to create a sort of like a template, which in fact, a year ago in Scotland, at the updating event, we actually did a workshop in terms of demonstrating its use. And there's also one on policy. We'd like to develop one for diseases, and we are looking for resourcing to do that. But again, this has been really helpful because when in the discussions with DEFRA, I showed them these documents, and in fact, they've become the basis for a lot of the discussions around integrated weed management across agriculture and amenity. So that's good news. So our response is there. We have put in a fairly strong response supporting CPD, and actually there's mention there because currently in the current plan it says it's a good thing to do CPD. We're actually nailing our colours to the mast and saying it should become a requirement. We think that CPD is that important. People I know who've had their operator training years ago and have done nothing else since. I mean, we had a speaker at our event who said he'd got his PA certificate many years ago, and of course he's never been involved with it, but technically he could start a business tomorrow involved with operator training, and he said he shouldn't be let loose with a sprayer, but technically he's got the certificate. So CPD is important. And the other thing that we have gone very strongly with is that we feel the amenity standard should become a requirement. It really is fundamental to our thinking about where we go forward, but I'll mention that again in a moment. Then a variety of things, as I say, we've talked about carbon footprint, and we've talked about communications, and we've talked about working more closely in terms with policymakers on how we communicate messages. We think there is a strong case for introducing some form of financial support scheme. I know at this time when everybody wants support, it's not necessarily the best time to talk about it, but local authority, if we are going to get local authorities to engage truly with integrated and look at alternatives and all the other things that go around, there is a cost to them. And so I think it's quite important that we recognise that in terms of what we do. I've had one local authority in Scotland talking to me recently where they were saying, it's very easy for people to say we move away from something we're doing now, and we've looked at the alternatives and it's going to cost us a lot more money. So it's quite important that that area is addressed. So in response on this section, I'm bound to say the first one, but I think it is important. We build on the success of the forum. And as I say, over the last year or so, we've been strengthening our links in the various countries as part of the UK. We think that's very important. Delighted, as I've said already, with our links with Scotland. We've got equally strong links in Wales, and in fact, we've got a major event coming up in Wales soon, and that is fantastic. So I think it's really important that you build on the success of that. We introduced the amenity standard as a requirement. This is a fundamental part and core to our response. We need to be able to demonstrate to all users that actually we're operating at professional standards and doing the job well. And I think the amenity standard is of its time. It's actually a game-changing moment for all of us, because if we can all display the amenity standard and demonstrate that we're part of a recognised assurance scheme doing things professionally, this is the way we need to go. I wouldn't employ an electrician without I knew that he'd got a recognised standard. We need to do exactly this, and I'm really delighted that this is actually being adopted. And it was great to hear again the minister say what he said, because it's really important, I believe. And we also think that needs to be linked together with enforcement. Now, this means that the various teams, Adrian in CRD and in the various countries, have the resource to do it. But we do think enforcement is important, because if not, you do get people outside the scheme who say, well, why should I do it? Because nobody checks. The third area is those who ensure those who use plant protection products do so safely and sustainably. And again, the document talks about, and this is good, the document actually refers to enhancing the system of enforcement for pesticides. And I think none of our members or none of the sector that are doing things professionally need worry about that. It can only do one thing, of driving out those who are not at that standard. It talks in the document about implementing legislation to reduce increased requirements at the point of sale, and I'll talk about that in a minute, and also about clear messages for amateur use. Sorry, I think I'll do it now, even though it might be a slide in a minute. When it comes to amateur products, in our response, we would agree about, we don't agree that there shouldn't be amateur products, but we do think there needs to be a strengthening of the messaging around them. I am a keen gardener. I've got an allotment of quite a large vegetable patch. I tried to compete with Peter Corbett, but he's on that light land over in the east of England. But it's really quite important that you know, I can go into a garden centre, I can buy a product off a shelf, and I go to the counter and say, can I have some advice? And they go, oh, we might have to contact head office. That is not good enough. And the other thing is that if I'm going to buy it, should I not somebody just check with me that I know what I'm buying? Because you know, you can go in and pick up what you like. And again, I've used this story before, but you know, there's a guy who has an allotment not far from mine actually, who said to me only a few months ago, I'm totally against the use of glyphosate. And I said, what have you, I saw you spraying the other day around the edge of your allotment. He said, oh, yeah, but I was using Roundup. That's an illustration of someone who went into a garden centre, bought a product, but thought he wasn't using a chemical for some reason. I mean, it's as simple as that. And we do think this point of sale for professional products is something, but again, we're working with Adrian and his team on that. So we support a stronger and more responsive and effective enforcement. We recognise that requires the resources within there. I just want to make the point, because sometimes the sector said to me, nobody seems to enforce. I can tell you that if I bring cases forward to any of the offices, CRD or any office, and tell them about it, they do act upon it. They do, as long as there's evidence. But I think they would love to have more resource so they could actually go out and spot check and do things, because that really would be another element in terms of this. And we must look at all aspects, not least carbon footprinting. And, you know, this is a key message from most governments. We hear that effectively we've got to get to carbon zero targets. And so it's really important when we look at methods, if we're going to transition to have less reliance on plant protection products, that we don't transition to approaches which actually have a higher carbon footprint or could do more damage to the environment. So it's really important that we look at the whole cycle of that when we're looking through. And obviously, we do think communication is important. This is something that the Amenity Forum over recent years has put quite a bit of effort onto it. I think it must have been about 2.5, 3 years ago. We addressed it in terms of our strategy. We recognised we were communicating, we felt, amongst ourselves, but we weren't doing necessarily as good a job as we should in these three main groups. So we were communicating to people who were members, but there were those in the sector who were outside it, and we needed to do a better job on that. We needed to do a better job on the public, because it's so easy for us to say, oh, they don't know what they're talking about, when actually we don't communicate with them. And we needed to communicate better with policymakers, because although we felt we were doing that well, so we have actually got a communication strategy. Members put some resource into it, and we've been working quite hard on it. Those of you who know, we do much more social media. You can go onto YouTube now, and if you really want to, and see my series of videos and video clips. I told the groups, I think it was last time, my grandson, young grandson, who clearly seems to spend an enormous amount of time on a screen, said to me the other day, "Grandad, you're a YouTuber." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I've found lots of YouTubes with you on." He didn't understand what I was talking about, but it was quite enchanting that he'd done that. Because, fundamental to this is we've got to raise awareness of what we do. And that part on the right, mentioned by the minister, mentioned by me all the time, is really important. And we've got a window now. Now, it's a terrible thing to say there's good things come out of this crisis, but the reality, we've been able to demonstrate that the people have used the parks, the amount of people who've used the parks over recent times, there's a real opportunity for us to demonstrate how important we do, what we do, and why we do it. Why is it that sometimes we're managing amenity areas, perhaps we're using a plant protection product, and we sort of, if you like, try to sort of make sure nobody sees us? Because if you do it in that way, people are all automatically going to say you're doing something bad. We need to be much more upfront in where we do. Now, we did launch a Get Moving website 2.5 years ago, and I'm going to admit, I think we got a part of this wrong. We got the part of producing the site right, but we didn't give enough thought to how we actually communicate the site to the public that we do. So we've gone through another process. We've completely revamped the site, and we're engaged with an external consultant to try and help us to ensure that we can then connect those messages to the public media, to the people we don't normally talk to. I've spent quite a lot of time in this job fending off inquiries, whether it be from Guardians, Independents, whatever, who sort of come to, we need to make the story rather than the other way around. And so we're spending a bit of time. We've piloted that currently in Cambridgeshire to see how it can work. And I think it's really, really important that as a sector, we get involved with that. I'll just check the time. I'm fine. We need to stand up and proud of what we do. And I know I've used this slide before. I will use it until I leave this role, because it really is important that we stand up. We had in mind last July, there was lots of planning had gone into it. The perennial, the horticultural charity were involved, and the media. We were going to, in last July, going to have, if you like, a celebration of what happens in Amenity, and it was going to be linked to charitable activity. Clearly that hit the dust. We're hoping this year to do something similar, but of course we want to link that with other organisations, and people like Bigger are doing a summer event, but we definitely need to up our game in terms of where we go. And I know you're going to say he's boring because he keeps on mentioning this, and I'm going to mention it at the end again. We must all get behind the amenity standard. We really have. Policymakers are very keen on it. Everybody's keen on the idea. We've got to get behind it, because by by ensuring that we do that, we can drive out bad practice. We can drive out that's not helping us at all. We can ensure we can continue to do what we do in the way we do it. But we've got to demonstrate to people that we're there. And my dream is that, I will tune into the Ryder Cup and I'll see on the first tee the logo of the Amenity standard, which demonstrates actually that everything being done on that golf course is according to the standard. My dream is the same in terms of, I was going to mention cricket, but if any of you follow cricket, cricket's God's game as far as I'm concerned. I'm a Yorkshireman and I've seen the score and I'm not happy. But essentially, when I go into my local park, so we're talking at the moment with the Parks Forum in London, when you go into there, you see that standard because it demonstrates that actually the people who are operating there belong to a proper scheme and know what they are doing. As I say, we want to strengthen obligations on sellers, or we're suggesting that needs to be looked at. Let's put it like that, because at the moment, as you know, when you go by, you've got to demonstrate you've got to say it's going to be used by a qualified operator. But that really probably needs there. We talked about the requirement for CPD. There's quite a bit in there about advisors, because at the moment that is not required, but in agriculture there's a move towards doing that. And of course in Amenity it is slightly different, because there are, advices often might be given by the distributor or it might be given by the contractor. But again, we're quite happy to engage in a discussion around advisor qualifications and how it goes forward. I've mentioned that already. We believe in a targeted campaign of inspection and enforcement, because we think and again, I'm not seeking to find, on a witch hunt, but I think it really is important. Sprayer testing is a classic example. Adrian mentioned it. Yes, there's a lot of sprayers tested, but does that really reflect all the sprayers out there that should be tested? And we've mentioned amateurs already, because I did it a bit earlier on. The fourth is to set targets to support reduction of risks and improve statistics and indicators. And again, we're in discussions about that. They want clear targets, and we absolutely would agree with that. But again, there need to be targets that are understandable and relate to amenity. And far too often in a lot of documents, I still see, this relates to amenity and crop production in amenity. Well, we don't produce crops. So we're all for targets. And part of my job is actually to continually report to governments about how well we're doing. Again, the minister initially mentioned the fact we report to Scotland each year on how well we're doing against those targets. But I'm all for better targeting, but it's about actually ensuring they relate to amenity, because we're not worried about scrutiny. I think that's really important to say, and we certainly are involved with research. And finally, their document talks about ensuring effective work with others to deliver the National Action Plan goals. We're putting we've had quite strong discussions recently with the VI. The VI Voluntary Initiative got a new chairman, and he and I had quite a straight discussion, because I think there has been a tendency for us not to talk to each other in the way we should. So with him, we've had at least 3 discussions already now. We've committed to maintaining regular discussion, because we have a lot of common agenda. And I think, the issue sometimes is that we can set one off against the other, when actually, if we get the strength of the voluntary initiatives, they can work really helpfully. And please, government, we can deliver if we work together. And I've had similar discussions with NFUs. I've had discussions with AICs, a whole series of organisations, because I think, but what's really important is that if I tried that 10 or 11 years ago, they would have probably said, don't want to be involved with you. Most people want to be involved with us now. And I think that's important that we now build on that partnership together. So this last slide was just to conclude, to remind you of the sort of 5 key pillars that we have. And I'm bang on time. And we're now going to move to a session, and it will be a brief session. Oh, sorry. There was a slide there about the IPM, but of course that's now been dealt with. I'm going to allow 20 minutes for this, and that will, how you want to organise it, be up to you. But if it allows 5 minutes perhaps for people to go and stretch the legs or whatever, make another cup of coffee or whatever, but also 15 minutes of discussion. And because of the numbers involved, we've had a slight issue. Kate is really good at magic, but sometimes because of the way the breakouts go, you might find yourself in a group of 1. It doesn't happen very often, but it does. But if you do, you're bound to agree with yourself, so that's fine. Can you elect a spokesperson for your group? Can you identify key issues facing your organisation as a result of all of this? And can you agree on up to 3 key areas? Now, when we had, I think on one of these updating events, we had something like 90 people. We clearly couldn't get reports back from everybody. So I'm going to say the same to you. Can the spokesman just drop an email to Kate after the event with just those areas that you wanted? Because this is really helpful for me. Very often I can say I'm speaking on behalf of the sector, but I do need to hear from you as well. And so I think this is quite important in terms of where we do. But we will ask for 1 or 2 report backs, or there will be questions which we can do when we all come back. So I see Kate has appeared. Kate is going to press a button any minute now. And by the way, don't worry about measuring how long you've got, because you will find when you've got 60 seconds left, a little clock comes up telling you you've got 60 seconds, and then you come straight back into the group. So over to Kate to split you into your groups. Well done, Kate. Magic works again. Magic works again. Right. As I say, what we can do is we can sort of ask for reports back, or I think what we might do is if there's any specific questions. Now, Kate, you're still there, Kate, aren't you? Oh.
Yeah, no, I'm still here.
Yeah. There is a function, as you probably all know, you can raise your hand, because there's quite a number not on video. So I'm going to ask Kate if she can just keep me right if I miss anybody. So first of all, are there any specific questions for Adrian or myself? If you want to raise your hand, or even if you just want to shout out, we can answer those now, and then we'll move on to the groups. Is there anybody there? Yes, I've got somebody with a hand.
Yeah, hi there, Colin Reid here. Question for Adrian. In terms of the changes to legislation, etc., moving forward, are there any plans to change the accreditation in terms of the PA1, PA2, PA6? Is that going to remain the same?
That's a good question, Colin. That remains the same as it is at the minute. I think whether anything comes back out the National Action Plan consultation that says about sort of changes or anything like that, that may well be something, but there certainly isn't anything planned at the minute, not as a result of exit or anything like that, Colin.
Right, okay, thanks.
But I think just building on that, that also, whether there's extra requirements, which relate to CPD, because as Adrian will tell you, in the current document, it sort of advises that you do CPD, and if there's an incident, it's quite good you can prove it, but it doesn't say it's a requirement, and that's a discussion that's ongoing at the minute as to whether, in addition to having that initial certificate, you need to have some evidence of engagement. But as I say, as Adrian said, nobody knows yet. That's where we are. Any other specific questions Yes, I've got another. I can see somebody with a hand up, so that's good.
Hi
Yes,
there.
carry on.
Just to touch on that, with the issues we've had with lockdown, obviously a lot of the training centres are closing down and don't seem to be opening anytime soon. Do you see that as being an issue with kind of going forward into the new seasons and stuff?
I mean, it is something, Gordon, that we started talking to Basis and Lanta and others about this time last year, sort of in March last year, around virtual training and things like that.
Yeah.
And basically, they set up their systems to carry on doing things. I think there were one or two questions around sort of a bit like the government had with sort of driving tests and MOT certificates and things like that, some of the legal bits, but that didn't arise as an issue. So I think we're past the stage of sort of anything being an issue, hopefully. But we are in regular contact with sort of Basis, Lantry City and Guilds, etc. around these things. So just to reassure you, Gordon, thanks.
And I think all of them have developed schemes. I mean, Basis, for example, I mean, I've only just recently appointed a head of digital learning because I think there are issues around it. I mean, it's a bit like me, isn't it? I mentioned sort of the YouTube side. If you go to videos I produced in April last year and compared to now, there's quite a big difference. And I think we've had to learn a lot about how we do it. I think the other thing is there's a resourcing issue because some of the CPD stuff, for example, I'm not picking them out, but I happen to know for Basis, you've got to be careful you don't have too much commercial bias in them. So there's an issue there. But I think we've come a long way. And it was interesting the other day, I think I was talking to somebody at Lantra who sort of said, once we get to the other side, as they put it, basically, we won't go completely back to where we were because actually we've proved that some of these go. So I think the only other thing as well that I've lobbied the groups like Lantras, Sitting Guilds and Basis is that they've got to provide more opportunities for people to earn points because in Amenity that can be quite a challenge in terms of earning points. By the way, if anybody who on the Basis scheme now, if you email Kate at the end of this event, she will register you and she'll tell you how many points you can get from it. But what I'm trying to say is, I think that it's quite an area of work we've got to put a bit more effort into doing, really.
Thank you.
Well, certainly on PA1, there's a number of trainers who are now doing the PA1 bit completely remotely. And actually for employers are finding that actually is not a bad thing. Because it is much more cost effective. It does mean you can get 2 or 3 guys together, socially distanced, etc., in the relevant place. The practical is a little bit more of a challenge. So at the moment, that is obviously being held back. So there's quite a lot of people who have got the theoretical bit done. But are waiting for the practical as and when it's suitable to be able to do it.
Thank you, Peter.
If you use a biocide at the same time, then maybe you can actually be doubly secure in your practical.
That's good. Any other specific questions? If not, who's going to volunteer to be the first person just to do a brief summary of what you discussed in your group? I've got no idea who the groups are, so it just needs somebody to be brave and tell us. Right, I've got a hand up from Colin. Good, well done, Colin. That's twice. So I'm very happy with you. Right, Colin, do you want to report back from your discussion?
Yeah, group 1. I can't mind all the guys that were there. Peter, Gordon, Paul, a few of the guys there. With a general kind of chat to start with, and I think I've managed to catch everything. I'm not sure because I was doing a fair bit of talking myself. The big issue is obviously trying to reduce the use of PPP, and where we can try and reduce, look at other alternatives. there is a need to rely on the use of PPP, but getting the correct product as well as the alternative methodology is required. There's a public perception of glyphosate because of the amount of media and information that's been put out there about, it's a carcinogenic, it can cause this, it can cause that. There's maybe a need to actually try and counter that by actually getting more information out there and telling the public what we're doing, why we're doing it, why we're using it. We need to persuade the powers to be, for me, as a local authority. That's councillors, elected members, why we need to do what we need to do, why we need to use certain products. The public are used to well-maintained open spaces. How would they feel if the open spaces then became the opposite of that? They're perhaps not fully aware of what it takes to manage and maintain our open spaces. They think it's just nice, clean streets all the time. They need to look at integrated approaches to control pests and weeds. The use of herbicides can very often be required and could be the best option, in terms of carbon footprint, that kind of thing. And really just making the public more aware of why we use it, what we're doing with it, and why they need to use them.
Thank you, Colin. I mean, that's really useful. And we did produce some sort of guidance material for local authorities, because I do realise that pressure can often come not just from the public, but from councillors as well, down to officers to address this. One thing that, and I might explore after this with Alan and Romy, is whether we could look at how we could work with local authorities in Scotland and actually try and sort of see if there's a way we can work together to get a more consistent messaging around this. Because I think it's not about arguing for PPPs, it's arguing about the fact that we use them as part of a whole process. So I think there's a bit of work we could do there. So it's something I'll pick up afterwards. I don't know whether Adrian's got a comment, but
yeah, I mean, and I think a lot of those comments that Colin had were reflected in our group discussion as well. Which had probably about the other half of the meeting around sort of the whole sort of lack of availability of things to actually complement and have a full toolbox for using, and around public perception, particularly around the sort of all or nothing sort of thinking. There's no sort of grey areas in sort of a lot of the public thinking. You're either for or against pesticides, and there was also sort of a lot of discussion around the whole sort of how the regulatory standards increasing, etc., then causes problems around sort of availability of products, etc. And the current concern that was raised, particularly by Andy, I think, was around the whole, local authorities having to rebrigade their funding for COVID and spending more on, refuse collections or whatever, because they're having to socially distance workers and things like that, and then possibly not having the money to pay for some of the sort of the more nuts and bolts things that the Amenity Forum's interested in, and then whether they would be able to play catch up or not, and that whole sort of issue around the local authorities having to sort of try and rebalance and possibly even getting less money back again. And again, that'll impact on sort of, amenity contractors. It's the usual thing of, what's sort of best isn't necessarily cheapest, although it probably is best value in the long run. It's all that thing, I think, is a difficult one, John. But I think the main thing from which Gillian summarised quite nicely was the fact of, the National Action Plan consultation and responses gives a good opportunity to try and get some of these things sort of, developed a lot further now. So I think that's the sort of summary, John. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think this communication one is one we've actually got to address in a number of ways. I mean, I've used an example before, but there's a large local authority in England where exactly what you said, Adrian, that people just take for granted that the amenity spaces will be managed, and it's just a cost-cutting exercise. And he took he took a group of his councillors to a park in the city. Them, what do you want from this park? And they sort of said, well, we want a park. And he said, no. He said, what I want you to tell me is what you want from this park, because the way that I maintain the different areas of the park will depend on what use you have. And I think the issue we've got to get up the ante is that people do see these spaces as, we're not in the bad old days when actually, it used to be 4 or 5 sprays a year or whatever, irregardless. But we're still in a slight context where people don't understand, authority in London that moved away from using glyphosate completely and went to, in this case, I'm not knocking the approach, but went into hot foam, and then suddenly realised the costs were, just escalated beyond belief because it had to be. That's not saying that approach isn't right. I'm just saying it's about getting people to recognise what's involved with all of these things is really quite important. Right. Any other group want to report back at all?
I have an observation.
Hello?
John, may I make an observation?
Yes. Who's speaking?
Steve Dickinson, Rigby Taylor.
I thought it was.
Good afternoon, gentlemen, or good morning. Yes, good afternoon. Would there be merit in local authority or contractors operatives having handout A5 pieces of paper or laminates that they could give to members of the public who say, what are you spraying here today? And outlined on there would be the benefits of the chemicals, the names of them, their toxicity levels, and why they're being used, and with the periodicity of their use, which would educate them as to the periodicity of use of foam or hot water or whatever else when one thinks of particularly glyphosate and flazosulfuron, etc. So that's just one way, I think, of putting over the message.
Yes, it's interesting actually. Yes, that's yeah, please, yeah, good thought. I know we haven't heard from all groups, and we probably can't because of time. Now, there was one group I think was discussing the merits of alternatives such as, was it pelargonic acid? Which was that group?
Neil Wollaston here. That was group 4.
Right, Neil.
Yeah, we were talking about there's not really a cost-effective variant for glyphosate. I mean, price comparable, but you have your cartoon gold, your pelargonic acid, or your New Way wheat spray, the acetic acid, but they're about 22 times more expensive. Well, a lot more expensive than using glyphosate. We were talking about the education, if you could educate people about the safe use of glyphosate. I mean, the acetic acid that we use at the Botanic Gardens, for about 3 hours afterwards, the whole place stinks like a chip shop because the smell of vinegar. So we have to sort of communicate that to our public as well. So,
okay. Now,
yeah.
Sorry to put you on the spot. It's just I knew that you'd had a discussion around it. So please, can the spokespeople please send me the some key points? I don't want an essay, it can be just a very simple email, but it will help us when we accumulate things together. Right, we now come to a highlight because Peter Corbett is going to make a presentation to us on behalf of Rigby Taylor. So Peter, over to you.
Okay, off we go. Right. Well, what I thought, rather than sort of doing anything, I'd try something a little bit different today. This is might be a fairly contentious statement, but it's quite interesting through what's been talked about today, about communication, about understanding, etc. Hopefully this sort of fits the bill in terms of what we're looking at and what we're wanting to do, both as businesses, obviously supplying the industry, but also as an industry actually educating what we're trying to do. So thought we'd focus on vegetation management because Obviously, one of the key things that we do is vegetation management, and also to try and get people to understand a little bit more that we're actually living in a totally managed environment. And, you know, I do get somewhat frustrated when conservationists say that actually we don't need to manage. Well, if we hadn't managed, we wouldn't have the environment that we're in. And certainly in an urban environment, the amount of management that's required is way above what people expect. And man has been managing that environment over millennia. And control and management of vegetation is essential. And obviously, there's two things there. One is control, one is management. Control basically means you've got to kill it or manage it. Management may be that you don't want to kill it, but you just want to stop it getting too big or becoming a problem. So again, that's part of something that perhaps a lot of the public don't really understand. And obviously this year with COVID, maybe they have understood more, is that, well, actually nothing grows on the streets or down curb lines or whatever. Well, last year where people weren't actually managing it, it certainly shows that a lot of stuff can grow. So what is the objective primarily for managing vegetation? Well, ultimately it's to create a safe, visually pleasing environment that is fit for purpose. Obviously, there are some situations where you're actually trying to encourage one species over another. So, I mean, golf is an absolute classic, where obviously you're on your greens, you're wanting a very different environment to what you want in your fairways, your roughs, etc. So it's not just about controlling things, but it's about managing things. We are all wanting to take an integrated approach, and actually greenkeepers, groundsmen, and anybody involved in this sector, whether they like it or not, has been using integrated approaches for a very long time, because without it, actually you can't achieve what you're looking to do. And what do we mean by integrated approaches? There really isn't time today, but it's basically utilizing all the tools that are available in order to achieve your end objective, is what that's all about. Interestingly, if you look at the definition of pesticide and herbicide, what it means is that you are using something to remove whatever you've decided is a pest or a herbicide. So actually, it doesn't mean they're nasty chemicals. A hoe is just as good as herbicide or pesticide as actually something that you spray out of a bottle. So it is understanding things that actually managing vegetation is critical. And what we're aiming to do is to manage that vegetation in the best way. Man has been using all sorts of techniques to manage vegetation. And probably the most obvious and the one that actually had the biggest single impact and still does is obviously fire. Man uses fire to destroy vegetation and then allows, hopefully, a different form of vegetation to come back. Obviously, then there are other cultural techniques and there's physical removal. So given the strengths of time today, what we'll do is we'll just look at one specific treatment type and go through some of the processes. The other thing is we're all quite good at using big words, and really, what do we mean by sustainability? Well, sustainability actually is an in-phrase word. It's been around for a very long time, but it's really made up of three pillars in terms of what we mean by sustainability of a process or of a product or etc. There's the economy aspect. In other words, what does it deliver? What does it cost? There's the impact it has on society in terms of what do people get out of it? What do they benefit from it? And also then there's the impact on the environment. So all three of those bits are really quite relevant to a lot of the debates that we've been having and been talking about today. If you want to dumb that down, if you want to call it that, or put it into phrases that perhaps people understand, well, you can actually convert it into three pretty simple phrases. There's the cost or profit. So obviously, if you're a business, you might be actually saying it's got to be sustainable. Well, in order to continue to do it, you've got to be able to make a profit. So cost or profit. There's people and operators falling in society. Obviously, you've got to look after your staff, you've got to look after your operators. So that's absolutely important. You've also got to look at what's the impact on bystanders, etc., of any operations that you're undertaking. So if we then look at the final one, which is the planet and the environment. So sustainability is a combination of all of those three factors. There isn't one factor that overweighs all the others. You've got to look at all three factors in order to come up with something that is truly sustainable. I mean, within the 21st century, sustainability has generally referred to the capacity of the Earth's biosphere and human civilization to coexist. If I was wanting to be totally cynical, I could say the biggest single risk to biodiversity in this globe is organic farming. Because organic farming cannot sustain the population that we've got on this globe. Therefore, all of the other areas that we're not farming at the moment will have to be farmed in order to feed us. So actually, by organic farming, you could say, is actually the biggest single risk to sustainability within this global environment that we're in. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. So we can move on to an area that perhaps more of us are closely involved with. And what I was going to look at is vegetation management on a hard surface. Given the time we've got, you could look at the similar thing for all sorts of different areas, and you could very easily come up with similar bullet points for any of the different techniques or different areas that you're looking to manage. So what are we trying to do? Well, there are various options and there's various techniques that we can use. What we're all are, in effect, on a hard surface, is what we're looking to do is to kill things, because we don't actually want anything on the hard surface. Otherwise, people are going to trip over it. If we do want things, then we need to understand at what level we want things. And that's obviously where things like the Thanet scheme come into play, in that you can deal with a certain amount of vegetation on a hard surface, but maybe you want to define at what level you're wanting it to go to. But let's say in this case, we're in a city environment. High priority is that we actually have complete control of any weeds that are growing within that hard surface. So what can we do? Well, there's the conventional chemical control. We could certainly use glyphosate. Obviously, glyphosate's the elephant in the room in a lot of places, and hopefully I'll do something to actually help in terms of communicating that as we go through this presentation. What we can also do, and certainly I'm sure the guys who are representing councils would be absolutely delighted in this one, is that you can employ 10, 15, 20 times as many people than you've got at the moment, and you could send them out with hose. I'm not sure the unions would be too chuffed, and I'm not sure too many people would actually want to go out there hoeing and manually sweeping, scrubbing, etc. There are mechanical means, but mechanical means have their own risks. Obviously, basically, we're using friction to create the effect. So you're actually making whatever it is you're looking to control, you're separating it from its root. So in effect, it dies. So you're using a friction herbicide or a friction pesticide in that case. We can use thermal herbicides, and I purposely called them thermal herbicides because that is what they are. You cannot say that any technique is not a herbicide, because if you're looking to control plants, you are actually participating in the activity of using a herbicide. So flame is a great option. Obviously, that's something man started very well, but we can manage flame a little better. Effectively, that just cooks plants, boils them up, and destroys them. The only thing is with flame is it only takes the surface, so you've still got roots underneath, which can be an issue. Hot water, well, that can do exactly the same. You can scorch off that. But hot water is a pretty dangerous tool, isn't it? I'm sure the health and safety guys will have a few things to say if you're actually going around squirting hot water about. Because if you're doing any COSH assessment, I'm pretty sure that hot water would come out fairly high as being a pretty dangerous thing to be doing, and you'll be needing to put in practical measures to manage that. What you could do is you could contaminate your water with a bit of foaming agent, because actually hot water cools down very quickly, and in order to control something, you need to keep the temperature high for longer. So you could actually put a foaming agent in there so it insulates it. And that's really effectively what you're doing with the foam techniques. The most interesting one to me, and I'm sure this is the one that going forwards will actually be much more important than what we see now, is actually using electricity, because electricity has got the ability to control plants very effectively and very efficiently, much more so than the massive amounts of fossil fuels that you need to heat up water in order to get it at a hot enough temperature to destroy plant tissue. So all of these products have an impact on biodiversity. If you take a weed away, you are taking a food source away for something. And we have to accept the fact that if we want a clean, managed environment, then you will impact biodiversity. You can't not impact biodiversity if you're using any form of vegetation control. So what we're going to do now very quickly is just compare two of these options, and I've chosen the chemical one and the thermal one, against the three pillars of sustainability, so environment, society, and the economy. So let's look at the sustainability pillars as far as glyphosate is concerned. If we actually look at the economy, then the spraying is very effective, but we need to use good practice, because the last thing we want is what we can see on the picture on the right hand side, because that is totally not good practice. But if we use products effectively, we can avoid that type of situation and not see those sort of issues. The other thing is that actually spraying is a very rapid process. It's a very efficient process. And if we actually look at the cost of treating about 100 square meters, including the cost of labor, we're talking about 25 pence for something like glyphosate. So it is a very cheap method of controlling vegetation on a hard surface. Obviously, there's some society issues. Certainly, there are concerns about sprays, about herbicides. Also, the other aspect of it, and certainly it's quite interesting early on with somebody from the council saying, is one of their other problems is if they don't do it, they then end up being sued and have to end up paying compensation from members of the public because they've tripped over something that was being moved around because of vegetation. There is an expectation, and I think that's something we need to communicate, is what level of managed environment are we aiming to get to? There is the communication of the science and the data. And now what I want to do is just remove a few myths regarding glyphosate. So very quickly, there is one thing that all registration authorities agree around the globe, that glyphosate as an active ingredient is classified as non-hazardous. In other words, that active ingredient has no impact on cells, on our cells, and is non-hazardous. Whereas if you take soap under all regulations now has to have a warning sign, because if you get soap in your eyes, you are going to actually damage the tissues in your eyes. And also, if you look at the advertisements for soap powders, what does it say? Keep away from children. Why do you have to keep it away from children? Because actually, if you look at the stats, a number of children every year are severely damaged by getting under the kitchen sink and breaking open a soap tablet, getting it in their eyes, and they may not be able to see again. So it is not a hazardous product. It's actually a very, very simple molecule. And believe it or not, and a lot of people won't believe it, but glycine, which is a naturally occurring amino acid, is a key component for glyphosate. So basically what you do is you take a glycine molecule, you add a phosphoryl group to it, and that's glyphosate. People will then say, oh, hang on a minute, that's really, that's nasty. Phosphoryl groups being added? Well, actually, your body is doing this all the time, because glycine is a critical amino acid. It's a very simple one, and it's a building block for most other amino acids. And one way that you can build the blocks up, and I think they say you've got about 158,000 phosphoryl sites within your body, is to actually add a PO3H, and that will then allow you to make more complex proteins, etc. So it is a natural process, and it's carried out within our bodies the whole time. So we start with a very simple thing, glycine, which is a building block, and we can then end up with glyphosate. Look how similar those two are. Very, very similar in terms of not a lot added to it. So it is a very, very simple molecule. What we need to know about all pesticides is how they work, and certainly a gentleman on here would obviously have a huge amount more information about that. But in order for something to work as a pesticide, whether it be herbicide or anything else, it has to block or inhibit the target organism that you're wanting to control. So there's no point beating around the bush. What's the point of saying this thing's nice and lovely and cuddly? Well, actually, if you're a plant cell, glyphosate is far from nice and lovely and cuddly, because it will kill you. And that is that. So no point even thinking about it. How does it do it? Well, you're all fully educated now. So that process actually is how it does it. And what is that process? It's actually like everything in the body at a cellular level. There are processes, procedures, enzyme systems that have to go around in order to build things. Because remember, your body is just like a factory. What it's doing is taking very simple components and building it into more complex components. And that's basically what this pathway does. The interesting thing with this pathway is that it only exists in plants, because the way that we get amino acids is that we actually get them from the food that we eat. Well, plants haven't got that ability. So they have to be able to create amino acids. And what glyphosate does is it stops this pathway up here. So what's the result? Well, the result is that actually glyphosate is a very slow acting product. The reason for that is that plants actually contain loads of proteins. And if you treat them with glyphosate, what happens for the first sort of 5 days or so is the glyphosate moves around the plant, stops that process from producing any more proteins or amino acids, and effectively their plant will pull everything back. So if you look at a time-lapse picture of a plant treated with glyphosate, you'll see that the roots get pulled up, the top tissue starts to collapse, and what's happening there is that's the recycling of all the proteins back into the plant. After about 10 days, it'll start going brown, and then it dies. And that's why you have the classic symptoms of glyphosate, but you don't see it acting very quickly. It takes a long time in order to work. And this, to me, is the basic reason why, and it's dead simple, can't be simpler biology, is that actually glyphosate is non-hazardous. The reason it's non-hazardous is that as far as our cells are concerned, glyphosate is a complete irrelevance, because it doesn't need it, it doesn't touch it. People then say, well, it's terrible that you get glyphosate in your body and we all wee it. Well, to me, that's fantastic. That's brilliant, because you're taking glyphosate in on whatever, minute amounts. It's having no effect on your body and it's coming straight out the other end. What could be better? No bioaccumulation, no nothing. So you've got something that is inherently non-hazardous. So if we then put those things together, we can actually summarize it through in terms of that. The next bit we said we wanted to look at is the environment. obviously it'll have an impact on biodiversity. You can't stop that. But also the effect it has on our carbon balance. You know, we're looking to go carbon neutral, and certainly the use of using glyphosate to control vegetation, if you look at a ratio basis, has a ratio of 1. In other words, it's the lowest you can get, and I'll show you what some other things look at, but there's a whole load of scientific papers on this type of thing. And also, when you're using glyphosate, use very low water volumes, because we only spray a very, very small amount, and you also use very, very small amounts of actual product. So if we look at the thermal treatments, whether this be hot water or whether this be foam, the costings I've used are actually coming straight out of Foam Stream's literature. So hopefully I've converted them correctly. But I think from what people are saying, you know, you're comparing 25 pence to £5.50 as far as the cost of treatment per 100 square meters. It is complex. It needs a fleet in order to go out and do it. And again, time-wise, there's a lot more we could talk about, because actually the scheme works. The only problem is you have to use a lot more treatments than you would do using a conventional product. So it is a nice idea, but whether you like it or not, you can call it what you like. But as far as I'm concerned, this is a herbicidal process, because you're applying a herbicide, i.e. hot water and foam, via a machine. You're also consuming a huge amount of diesel, and also disrupting traffic, etc., because you need to have a fairly large vehicle to do it. So yes, it might be non-hazardous, but you are introducing something that isn't regulated. As far as I'm aware, there's never been any environmental testing on the foam that is added. We obviously know what happens if you put those type of products and you don't treat them, because what was back in the 60s, what was the biggest problem in rivers? Foam production, and obviously foam, even if it comes from starch, has a biological oxygen demand, which will mean that there's less oxygen in the rivers, therefore they're less healthy and all the rest of it. You get no control of perennial weeds, so you do need to come back and manage those. And the carbon balance ratio is about 22 times greater than that of glyphosate. So looking at those ones, you are also, and water is another key plank of sustainability, you need to use about 10,000 litres of water for every hectare that you want to treat. And you'll need to be treating 3 to 5 times a year. So that is an awful lot of water that you're going to be consuming using this supposedly sustainable technique. So I hope with that little bit, that statement that I said earlier, PPs used in the correct way are the most environmentally sustainable solutions to vegetation management. As far as I'm concerned, that's the data, that's the science, and that to me is actually a valid statement to make. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. That's good. Thank you very much indeed. Right. If you just bear with me for another 5 minutes, I know you're going to say I'm getting quite boring talking about the Amenity standard, but you're still going to get it. I want to just play a very short video clip that I produced last year, which I think is relevant to this, because it's a take-home message for me that I want everybody behind the standard. So, Kate, assuming you're there.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm here.
So Kate will now play a short video clip. I am continuing my series on the ongoing review of the National Action Plan being undertaken by national governments. The topic this time is assurance. Some of the key policy drivers influencing the National Action Plan review are illustrated here. And in this series, based on these, I've identified some key areas for our consideration, and these are shown on the following slide. It is important that as a sector we discuss matters arising from these issues as a means of both inputting into and/or influencing the review process. This time, my focus is on assurance. The pandemic has changed all our lives and created many personal tragedies. As we emerge from it, we have a really challenging time. What is clear is that we have a public now with a heightened awareness of health and safety. More than ever, they will seek assurances that practices meet legal and best practice requirements. This is certainly true in terms of amenity management. We need, as a sector, more than ever, to demonstrate our professionalism and full commitment to best practice at every level. Following its introduction at our 2019 conference, the Amenity Standard was formally launched earlier this year. It is similar to the Red Tractor Standard in food and agriculture. Those operating to the standard and displaying its logo will demonstrate their adherence to recognised assured standards in all tasks undertaken. Those making use of organisations and bodies holding the standard will be assured of professional levels of operation. The introduction of the standard has had enthusiastic support and backing from DEFRA and all UK national governments. This slide sets out the key purpose of the standard. It is a standard designed to cover all our important and diverse sector. It will be managed, certainly initially, by the Amenity Forum, who will audit assurance schemes brought forward to be part of the standard, to ensure that they meet requirements and provide assurance of professional levels of operations and adherence to best practice. Organisations who wish to hold the standard will need to be a member of an approved assurance scheme and fully support the objectives of the Amenity Forum. The Forum will cover its costs of audits from fees paid by the assurance scheme bodies. Currently, 3 assurance schemes have initially met the audit and are recognised: Amenity Assured, Lawn Assured and the PCA Invasive Weeds Management Scheme. However, more are currently being developed and considered to ensure full coverage of the sector and all its bodies. In summary, the Amenity Standard is a bespoke quality management standard developed in partnership by all sides of the sector and managed and audited by the Amenity Forum. We believe that the Amenity Standard can provide appropriate assurance of the sector's commitment to best practice and give the public and key stakeholders a clear way of ensuring operations meet legal requirements and provide the appropriate assurance to the public on health and safety standards. It is vital that all operating in the sector fully support this and get involved. If you are an organisation wishing to operate at the standard and want more information on how, or would like to put forward or develop an appropriate assurance scheme to meet the requirements of the standard, please contact Steve as shown, and for all other inquiries contact Kate at the Amenity Forum office. Going forward, we know how tough it will be as we seek to recover from the impacts of the pandemic. What happens in Amenity impacts upon every UK citizen every day, and we need to ensure that all who operate in amenity management do so at the highest standards and can demonstrate it. The public and policymakers need assurance. Members of the Forum committed to best practice can deliver this, and widespread adoption and acceptance of the standard can ensure not only further increases in standards, but overall public confidence in our sector. Thank you. Thank you, Kate. Thanks for that. Sorry about the slight wobble there. It's my fault, Kate. I hadn't talked to you about it before. Just a couple of things before we conclude on this, though. Can I just say that there are 2 other schemes that have now been developed, assurance schemes, developed and approved and audited. One is for golf, which is backed by Bigger, and one is for sports services, which is backed by the GMA. They will be launched later this year. They're ready to go as schemes, but basically, as you can imagine, with everything that's happening at the moment and lockdowns, we felt it was better to wait till later in the year. So it does mean that every scheme's covered, and we're also in discussion on the Section 18 highways scheme becoming part of the standard as well. So I think that covers everything for today. I hope you found it useful. As I say, you can get hold of all the presentations. Again, my thanks to the speakers, but also thanks to the Scottish Government. And as I say, particular thanks for the Minister for taking time to make that presentation. I think it's really important. And it illustrates that what you do is recognised by people. But again, clear message today is communication as we go through. Thanks to Rigby Taylor for supporting this particular event. As I say, it's been great. It's been very different to my normal way of doing updating events, but there you go. And please, 2 other quick things. One is the Spray Operator of the Year award, which was not run last year because of the conditions we're in, is running. So entries are open very soon for that. And remember our conference, which if I've got the date right, and Kate will shout at me if I get it wrong, I think it's Thursday, October the 15th. Is the date for, is that right?
I think so. It might be the 21st. I can't remember.
Don't you say I think so. That was Thursday, October the 15th. It will be at the Kettering Conference Centre, assuming everything's back on track. But as we proved last year, we're very flexible. We can always do it virtually if we have to, but so make a note of that. So thank you again for attending. Thank you all for your contributions, and have a good rest of the day and going forward. Thank you.
Cheers, thanks.
Cheers.
Thanks, Sean.
Thank you.